All right, hello, economics students. It is 2021 and we're on our fifth lockdown. And I'm recording a video about the 2022 budget. So this is the last dot point for our budgetary policy outcome. You need to understand initiatives or basically budgetary policies from the past 2 years. So you do need to understand what has the government been doing with their policies, with their budgetary policies. You can use any of those policies from the past three budgets, even though it says the past 2 years, that's effectively 2 years. And we need to think about how they're going to impact our three macroeconomic goals and therefore improve our living standards. So let's just go back a bit and have a think about last year. So we didn't have a budget last year, or at least it was postponed due to COVID, but we had plenty of budgetary policy initiatives. There was record spending, JobKeeper payments, job seeker increases, which was effectively like a New Start allowance. They were sending out checks to households. They were allowing businesses to write off the cost of assets. So there was heaps of expansionary policy going on last year, which resulted in a record deficit, $161 billion, huge, literally off the charts, the deficit. And it forced the government to issue $250 billion in new debt. So remember, when they've got a deficit, they need to find a way to finance that. So they go out to the market and they sell bonds. Now, I'm not that bad at maths. I know that 161 doesn't equal 250, but I would imagine that they've had to issue more debt for some of the policies that were sort of outside of the budgetary period, and some future policies that we're going to look at now. So that brought our total debt to close to $1 trillion. That's gross debt. And as a result of this highly expansionary policy, as we've been talking, or highly expansionary budget that they finally announced, we've been talking about how well the economy has recovered. So let's have a look at the current state of the economy. So after a huge spike up in unemployment, it's come right back down. The Treasurer said in his budget speech that he wants unemployment to have a 4 in front of it, which is sort of like a commitment to the NAIRU target of 4 to 4.5%. We're currently at 4.9%, even though my chart's not updated. So we're very close. However, we'll obviously have some lockdowns at the moment, and they're going to have some future impacts on the achievement of our goals. Low inflation hasn't been achieved yet. It's 1.1%. We want it to be sustainably within 2 to 3%. So we haven't achieved inflation yet. And remember, that's sort of like symptomatic of slow growth, although growth has been picking up recently. So we need to have 3 to 3.5% growth in GDP to achieve our strong and sustainable growth target. We haven't done that because the annual rate from March to March is 1.1%. However, the economy has been growing in the last couple of quarters by 3% and 1.8%. So it's not technically achieved, but we're on the right track. Okay. So as a result of this, remember, the government's going to look at the current state of the economy. They've run another highly expansionary budget in 2021-22. It was actually a pretty boring budget, even for me. And I would say there's been a slight shift in focus from the household sector to the business sector, which we'll look at in a moment. So last year was very much about supporting households and giving them payments and allowing them not to pay their mortgage and allowing them to access the super and JobKeeper, JobSeeker. This year is a bit of a move to businesses. There's also talk by the government about it being a women's budget. They were heavily criticised last year about their budget, which didn't help women. Women lost more jobs on average over the COVID crisis. Women definitely do more of the homeschooling and the home duties than men, and yet there wasn't any support and there wasn't any acknowledgement of that. So this year they said, we're going to make it a women's budget. And we can debate that. So it was a highly expansionary outcome. And overall, basically, the Treasurer was saying that he believes the economy is heading in the right direction to achieve our goals, and he thinks this budget will help them do that. Now, of course, this is back in May. We're now in almost August, and Sydney and Victoria are on lockdown. Half the country's in lockdown, so things change. The economy is a dynamic place. What were those policies back in May? Okay, let's get to it, Mr. Vellon. Temporary expenses for businesses, temporary expensing, tax cut for households, increase in childcare subsidies, increase in funding for aged care, infrastructure spending, and heaps more. Remember, you don't have to use mine. You can pick anything from the budget that sort of piques your interest. So basically what they said was to businesses, we need you to spend, we need you to go out and invest in new capital and equipment and technology. And if you do that, for every dollar you spend, we will reduce your taxable income by that dollar. Basically, you don't have to get into the accounting, but basically incentivizing businesses to get out and invest in capital and equipment. Okay, it's estimated to have reduced the revenue of the budget by $20 billion. And obviously an increase in I increases AD and economic activity. Now you should, to the side, put your aggregate supply hat on and think, well, this is also going to increase the capacity of the economy because we're increasing the quality and quantity of resources. And that's true. It's an aggregate supply policy too. But we're just looking at it from an AD perspective for now. The LMITO is just basically a tax cut for middle to low income earners. At the end of the year, when you submit your tax return, you're going to receive $1,000 back. And that obviously means that households have a larger disposable income, which they might go out and spend. And that's what we want. Increases aggregate demand and activity and brings us closer to our goals. Now, the childcare subsidy program is primarily an aggregate supply policy, but this was one of those policies that the government said, hey, this is targeted towards women, as they're usually the ones doing the caring for children. I won't go into the details of it. Primarily aggregate supply, like I said, but whenever the government spends money, so they've committed an extra $1.7 billion. Remember, whenever the government spends money into the economy, it's an injection, and in this case, it's an increase in G, which is an increase in aggregate demand. So we could think about it as an aggregate demand policy too. Same for aged care funding. They committed $17.7 billion over the next 5 years. It's an increase in G, increase in AD, so on and so forth. There's so many infrastructure policies that you could pick. If you are interested in the Great Western Highway and the Newcastle Airport, go for it. Go and have a look at it. The Bruce Highway in Queensland. I think we did in class like the Metro Tunnel and the NBN. The government's been spending lots and lots of money on this, and they committed to some new projects in this budget. So just to visualize the deficit, we had the huge record-breaking deficit in 2020-21, or at least we had estimated it to be that size when the budget came out. We're now past through the financial year. And we're also estimating that the deficits are going to get smaller over time, which means the budget's going to get less and less expansionary, but still expansionary. And of course, that's because we have to bring the budget back into surplus, or at least the Treasurer believes they need to bring the budget back into surplus. Let's think about how that might impact debt. Remember, whenever you run a deficit, you have to head out into the market if you're a government and say, hey, we're selling bonds, we need to finance our deficit. So whenever this number is below zero, there's going to be an increase in the government debt. And that's exactly what's happening here. It's growing, albeit growing by a slower rate as we get into the later years of this chart here. So remember, just as a side point, as the deficit gets smaller, debt still increases, just not by as much. Okay, that's gone way longer than I wanted to, but just a review of the economy at the moment and the 2021-22 budget. Bye for now.